Welcome, everybody. I'm here with, I've been eager for this for quite some time. I'm here with a good friend, James Filler. Many of you have heard me continually citing his work and referring to him. His first book, Heidegger, Neoplatonism, and the History of Being, Relation as Ontological Ground, is a must. It's a must. It's a fantastic book. I was telling James just before we turned everything on to record that his work and William Desmond's work, and they go together, those two, and then both go together. I argue with my work so well. It's just having a profound impact on me, and making it possible for me to argue for a post-Kantian Neoplatonism that can deal with the powerful scientific revolution that's happening in biology with the work of people like Michael Levin, and also in cognitive science with 4E Cog Sci and the work of Eric Hole. There's a very exciting time. Also, of course, a very worrying time. And there's lots of important issues, the meaning crisis. And I pointed out that James has, in this book, did extraordinarily good work showing the ontological basis for some of the troubles we find ourselves within, both philosophically, and I mean that not just academically, I mean in a broad sense of the word, and even culturally. And of course, James has now the second book out, Substance Ontology and the Crisis of Reason. And the first book and the second book are equally great, and they should be read together. And your life is a mistake if you have not bought both books and have not studied them deeply. Whereas I think the first book is a standalone book. I don't know if this book is quite a standalone book. I think it needs the first book, but James, you can correct me on that in a minute if you want. The reason I say that is because this book basically lays out a genealogical and conceptual argument for why substance ontology basically leads into the crisis of modernity that we see basically in the figures of Descartes and Kant. And what I liked about James is he equally gives a historical account of how these ideas led to each other, but he also shows their inner logical relations of implication. And he made such a tight case that it's the book could be heard as saying that substance ontology entails dualism and solipsism, and then I would thereby say also nihilism as an inevitable consequence of those two. And of course, this is fantastic. We'll go over the core of the argument in a minute. I just wanted to really emphasize how beautifully these books are written, how tightly they are argued. They're excellent historical scholarship, and there's no sense of nasty polemic or political acts being ground in these works. There is a purity of intent to get at the most relevant truth. So welcome, James. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Appreciate it.
So, James, we could do what I did last time. I could go over what I think you're basically saying, and like in a little quick gist, not more than 5 minutes, and then you can start to unpack it. You can start to and we can get into some of the more details. Would you like to start that way? Is that a good idea? So, James, start with Parmenides, which is, I think, an excellent place to start. And you get an argument for a substantial knowing, a substantial conception of being, something that is completely independent, exists completely on its own. And the problem with the Parmenidean account is it leads to for many people are very questionable conclusions, such that like motion does not exist, change does not exist. So when you get this absolute oneness at the expense of any relationality, unlike the Neoplatonic one, see the previous video between James and I, you get into all these performative contradictions, like who does Parmenides think he's talking to? What does he think he is? Is he not? to the degree to which he is distinct and talking about the one somehow illusory in nature. And you get all these performative contradictions, and and Zeno saying very famous things. I traveled all the way to Athens to tell you there's no motion, and just and so there's the seeds of problem in there. Now this gets taken up in the Christian tradition, not at least initially not as extreme as Parmenides, although I think there's almost an attraction back towards Parmenides, because there's an acceptance of that prioritization of a substance ontology in which as you put it very clearly, unity is given absolute priority over plurality. So you go into Anselm and you do Anselm on the oneness of God, and then there's this this pattern that you keep pointing to, especially in Anselm on Aquinas, which is the unity of God is accessible by reason, but the plurality is an absolute, and that they have to talk about it because of the Trinity, but the plurality is an absolute mystery. And it's like, I think what's behind your point is it's equally symmetrically possible to find the plurality, right, rationally acceptable, and the oneness an absolute mystery. And why the prioritization is never argued for, other than, as you argue, the assumption of a substance ontology. And then, of course, you proceed from Anselm into Aquinas, and you get this notion developed more and more. You'll be able to fill in details. And then that notion of the unity of God, because it's grounded in the notion of substance, that which exists independently and non-relationally, etc., goes into Descartes, and Descartes, right, proposes that he takes over the whole substance ontology. He's completely willing to challenge everything else from scholasticism. He prioritizes epistemology over ontology, reversing the scholastic and ancient world, but he still assumes the substance ontology. And then he gets into the two related problems, which he has two substances. And because they're substances, they completely independently exist from each other, and then therefore they cannot possibly interact. And this, of course, is the famous mind-body dualism. But there are other dualisms, which is the dualism between God and the world. How could there be any relationship between God and the world? And that has an epistemological problem, which is, how could I possibly know the world? Because if I'm a substance and the world are substances, how do we get relations between these things can completely independently exist from each other? And don't think you can sneak in causal relation, because it falls prey to the same argument. And then Descartes famously tries to get out of that by saying, well, we can somehow know God, but we have to know God from completely inside the mind. And then what James does is he goes through the problem that everybody learns in school, with the famous Cartesian circle. In order to prove that clear and distinct ideas get us at reality, he has to prove that God is not a deceiver. But in order to prove that God is not a deceiver, Descartes seems to have to assume that clear and distinct ideas give us the truth. And that's a circle. Arnaud pointed that out way back at the beginning. Now, James is right to say Descartes' aware of this. He's not an idiot. And Descartes tries to get out of it by making an argument about the cause of my idea of perfection cannot be my mind itself. He's trying to get an argument outside of a kind of solipsism. And James goes through it very carefully, and maybe we can talk about it, but I think I don't find anything deeply problematic about the arguments. I think they're very solid arguments, which shows that all of Descartes' arguments for the causal exteriority of whatever causes my idea of perfection are at best plausible arguments. They are not arguments that give what Descartes requires, which is certainty, because Descartes sets that up as the only standard. And James says very correctly, Descartes has to have that because he has a substantial notion of the mind. You're sealed inside the mind, and the only thing the mind can give authority to, right, is that which has absolute certainty. Everything else could just plausibly be an idea in the mind. And so what you get is and I won't repeat all of this because I did this Awakening to the Meaning Crisis series, and I did the book. Once you're in that Cartesian position, solipsism, skepticism, an absolute kind of nihilism, are just are inescapable, inevitable. And then you have the disaster of the meaning crisis. You have the crisis of reason, in that reason gets locked inside of itself, can't ground itself, and completely keeps falling into inability to justify itself. And then, of course, um, we get various postmodern critiques.
Right.
And so, how is that? Was that a good take on the book?
Sounds good to me. Definitely very good.
So, I mean, I like the line. I mean, there could have been other people in the line, between Parmenides and Anselm. There could have been Augustine and a whole bunch of other things, but you weren't trying to be exhaustive in your genealogy. You were trying to give exemplary turning points,
Right. Can't just, it's not possible to be exhaustive. So,
Right.
I have had a few people say, oh, wish you'd have included Augustine. I was like, well, that would have been nice, but, I can only include so much.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention one person you missed, because I went into the detail of my own work, which is Occam, and Occam's nominalism as following pretty powerfully from the substance ontology that's within Aquinas.
Didn't
And
I didn't I include Occam in the book?
yes, you did include
Oh,
Occam.
okay.
I forgot to include Occam in
Oh, okay.
my review. And then, because for me, I think there's this straight line from Occam through Descartes to Kant. I think Kant brings out, because Descartes sort of holds the a priori as somehow giving us access, and then Kant does he says, well, why should I believe Occam and Descartes that logic is like what grounds and justifies the a priori, and then of course you get Kant's nominalism becomes, well, Kantian idealism, and
Right.
that becomes extremely problematic.
It's just the same thing, I think, in my opinion.
I think so, because you have all the weird things. Somehow you've got the mind somehow knows itself directly, but it can't know the world directly. And you have all these weird privilegings, and this is where postmodernism makes legitimate critiques: is why is this privileged and this is called into question, and right, and all of that sort of stuff is happening. So, given that I seem to have got at least the gist of the argument, and like I said, it's very convergent with the argument Chris and I made in Awakening, and with a lot of other arguments. Um, it seems, therefore, a fair conclusion, one I've drawn from your work, but I think that is now made even more intense by this book, and I mean intense in a good way, is that we're not going to get out of the meaning crisis unless we're willing to deeply challenge substance ontology. Which means challenging it even in its original form. Like, because you also do Aristotle, right? But you did
Right.
Aristotle in the first book as well, which is, the idea that somehow the subject predicate logical grammatical structure of language is definitive of the structure of reality,
Yeah.
as opposed to, what you call relationality, what Desmond would call common unity, community, the community of being as being its primary or primordial phenomenological sense for us. Is that a fair conclusion? If substance ontology entails the crisis of reason and skepticism and nihilism and etc., then getting out of this requires rejecting that.
Yeah, I want to be a little bit cautious because
Yes.
there is difference between things. I'm not my cat, so there is a difference in the being between me and other things.
Sure.
But we can't make substance ontology primary, and that's what
that's right. That's right.
It arises out of this fundamental relationality. I think if we make it primary, then we get all these problems. But
yeah, I agree, and that's all I meant to as the target. Yeah. I'm not denying. It's like it's the move that Putnam makes when he makes a distinction between distinctions, which are to claim that two things are not logically identical, and dichotomies, which is to claim they have that there's an ontological basis.
Right.
Yes, I'm not claiming that our propositions about the world that have a certain structure can't be true. That would be a performative contradiction. What I'm claiming is when we try to come up with a theoretical account of what is most real, the structure of language is not the ultimate authority from which we get our sense. Is that a legitimate claim to make? Because another theme running through your book is, and this lines up with the argument I've made about propositional tyranny, is the backgrounding of non-discursive knowing, non-discursive reasoning, and the mystical is dropping out of the picture and not playing any significant role.
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's one of the, in my view, that's one of the primary differences between post-Cartesian rationality and pre-Cartesian rationality.
Right.
Or even the scholastics still talked a lot about intuition, which was this non-discursive understanding. We've kind of bastardized that now, because now intuition's just kind of this gut feeling I get on occasion.
Yeah.
But prior to Descartes, I think non-discursive reasoning, and I think going back to Plato and the ancients, non-discursive reasoning was the primary basis of rationality, and that's the primary way we understand truth. Logic supports that and helps it, but it's not. It's not, I don't think, and maybe I'm being a little too dogmatic, the primary way we come to know. And it can't be. I make this argument in my classes when I teach. You've got discursive and non-discursive reasoning. Those are the two types of reasoning. Non-discursive reasoning can't lead to the truth because it's either deductive, in which case the conclusions are dependent on the premises, and somewhere you have to have a premise that's not the conclusion of a deduction, where you just get this infinite regress, and the other is induction, which gives you probability, but never the certainty that, certainly Descartes wants. So you've got this kind of hole in discursive reasoning that if that's all you're going to get to, if that's all you're going to give to reason, then you really can't get very far. And I think that's one of the problems that we've got since Descartes. We completely abandoned this non-discursive reasoning.
I agree. I mean, what's happening, and that comes out in your discussion around the light of reason. The light of reason is going from something of sort of an ontological nature, that is for example, in Plato, right? The light of the sun and all that sort of thing, the metaphors. And then in Descartes, it's like he's right on the boundary, but it's becoming something like analytic formal consistency, right? So I get a system that is analytically formally consistent. The problem, and Gödel showed this formally and logically, is you can't get a system that is both consistent and complete in a formal analytic sense. So that's the bug in all of this machinery that is constantly unraveling it. So do you think there's an intrinsic connection between relationality and, well, let me put it this way. Let me try another word. If we move into non-discursive, many people would argue, I think I've made the argument that we're also moving beyond a representational notion, which is another central notion that comes to fore because of the substance ontology. There must be something in here that represents. So we give up a contact epistemology, replace it with a representational epistemology.
Right.
And then Kant goes, about that. Now, what's interesting is the contact epistemology is maintained. It just gets sucked inside the mind. The mind is still directly in contact with itself in both Descartes and Kant. So they have an implicit and foundational contact epistemology while espousing explicitly a representational ontology. Why I'm going into all of that is because if we give up a representational ontology, I'm thinking of Pickstock and Desmond and a whole bunch of other people, we're back to something like a contact epistemology, where there is real relationality, real conformity, mutual transformation, all these kinds of things. And that seems to me to bring back a notion of participation, which seems to make that notion of intuition, and I mean this non-pejoratively, I mean it properly, it's a mystical notion now. I know by being deeply at one with something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of the things, I said last time that I felt like I was being maybe a little unfair to Aristotle, because one of the things that I find profound about Aristotle when I read him for the first time is his claim in, I believe it's on the Soul, that the mind becomes what it
Yes.
contemplates.
Yeah.
It's not just, and this is a real ontological unity between
Yes.
the mind and what it knows. And that, when I first read it way, way, way back in my first ancient philosophy class, kind of freaked me out because I didn't know what to make of that. But I've come to find that a really attractive way to, not just attractive, I think it's true. That's the basis of knowledge. When we get into such a relationship with something that we are in union with it, that's when we know something. We don't know something propositionally. That's not knowledge. It's the difference between knowing my wife and knowing about my wife. I can know how tall she is and this, but that's not knowing my wife. I know my wife because I'm in a relationship with her. I know her. And so, I think that's something we lost.
So let's build on that a little bit, because I've been also, and here again, deeply influenced by Desmond, and also the work I've been doing with Greg Enriquez and others. That if we can just use some metaphors here, just so I can make some distinctions. The horizontal relationship, like between you and your wife, or like you and anything in the world, actually, that you come to know. Although your wife is a very good existential example. I often use that example myself, right? I mean, one of the reasons why such horizontal participation is possible is that both the knower and the known both participate in the same principles or patterns or processes, right? And that's kind of a vertical participation.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's the reason that that's a possibility at all is because of this underlying relational foundation for all things. At really at the root bottom, we're already connected. So it's, I guess, maybe tapping into that connection or recognizing that connection or seeing that connection is maybe how I would describe this coming to know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm trying to address kind of a one-sidedness in which people are starting to be willing to acknowledge, for example, in CogSci, this sort of horizontal participation relation. But I'm trying to argue, a la Plotinus, I think, that the horizontal relation ultimately depends on a vertical participation. And that, of course, is a Platonic notion as well. There's an ontological basis to participation that makes possible the epistemological basis.
That's what I think. That's what I was trying to say, just in different terms. But it's that the relationship we have with the ultimate source of being, this relationality, that allows this the knowledge between the particular things that exist. Yeah, it's interesting for Plotinus. Plotinus, for the further away we get from that, the less being we actually have.
Yes, yeah. So given that, I mean, like I say, a lot of this is getting convergent argument from biology and from sort of information theoretic ideas, in quantum mechanics, the measurement problem. I won't review all these arguments about why a vertical ontology is becoming more and more deeply plausible in terms of trying to explain the kinds of discoveries and the kinds of arguments we're making. Um, what then does that mean, though, for how people should be living? What I mean by that is um, our culture is very much oriented towards the horizontal and being isolated on the horizontal. And of course, it's important to try and get people into the relationality this way. But for many people, here I'm thinking again, I'm influenced a lot by Desmond, right? Many people have lost the practices that give them a phenomenological awareness, a psychological cognitive functionality for the vertical, right?
Yeah.
Like for many people, when we say this, um, let's say they're showing up in good faith. They're not just, uh, the monsters of modernity. Um, they're showing up in good faith. And they're saying, but I don't know what you mean. What do you mean by the vertical? I mean, and James, what I'm asking for is something like a little bit more difficult. We've made great conceptual arguments for what we mean by it, but like, where would someone practice? Where do you practice such that this has a phenomenological content, a psychological and an existential impact on you, so that it has real? I'm going to be deliberately funny here. So it has real substance for you.
Yeah, that's a. First off, I probably don't practice it well enough. Um,
Your humility is admirable, James.
well, it's a reality. I don't live the way I think I ought to live far too often.
Mm,
Um, I mean, I'll just for me, it's my religious practice, my spiritual practices, my church
mm,
life, the sacramental for us Orthodox. That's very important,
mm.
and that's a way we come into this mystical union with the higher reality, or God. Just call it what it is, God.
Yeah, sure.
Um, and part of the problem, I'm a product of my culture. Part of the problem is that, like other people in our culture, I tend to be very self-oriented, which is,
Mm,
if I'm right, and I argue that this is the case, that's kind of the essence of evil or sin, or
mhm.
yeah, is this turn towards the self, this self-oriented, this selfishness, egocentrism. Um,
But you do make the point, like that notion is based. I mean, things are always the shadow side of things we like, right? And the modernity is defined as, think of Kant, in terms of autonomy.
right.
But autonomy is just the epistemological landing of a substance ontology.
Hmm.
Is that fair?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. And Charles Williams, I don't know. Are you familiar with Charles Williams?
Yes.
The Inkling? Uh,
Yeah, I've read two of his books.
I've read all the novels, but none of the rest of it. The Descent into Hell is a really, really
Yep.
interesting book, and the way it portrays sin is this guy just becomes further and further and further isolated from everything around him, such that he creates these kind of images that become real out of his head. And the final scene in that book, if I remember right, it's been a while since I read it, it's just him sinking further and further and further and further and further down into
Yeah.
himself. And that's the descent into hell that the title of the book is all about. This descent into myself, isolated from the rest of reality. And
It's also in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. The Underground Man is
yeah,
exactly that, and he gets into this nihilistic hell. And I mean, it's such a powerful book to read. I taught a course. Well, it was part of a course I taught last year. Because you absolutely hate this guy when you read the book. Like if you don't, there's something wrong with you, right? And then, but the way but he does exactly what you're talking about here. He's just Kant's autonomy taken to its fruition,
yeah.
which of course is Dostoevsky's point.
And, part of it is to break free of that. We have to. And one of the things, and I think one of my professors, Philip Roseman, talked about this in his book and in the class I took with him. We truly find ourselves in the other. And I mean, he's not the only one. I think probably Buber does it with I and thou.
Yeah.
But
Socrates, the
yeah,
dialogical self.
yeah. And we have to, this, maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but
No, you're not, James. Keep going.
we've really lost a lot of us have lost the willingness to sacrifice ourselves for other people. Um, we're willing to do it if it doesn't hurt too much or if it doesn't cost too much. But as soon as it really costs me something important or my life, then it's like, no, that's harming me and I shouldn't do that. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. If I understand things right, that's precisely what love is to sacrifice yourself for the other, even to the point of, death. That's what, greater love has no man than this, he laid down his life. And I was listening to some people at work the other day talked about this. It's like, I saw somebody and they wanted help, but I wasn't going to help them because I didn't know what they were going to do to me. And I'm like, that's really kind of hurts me to hear that. I get it, and I don't want to criticize it too much because there's a lot of badness that happens when we try to help. But there's something wrong with that we live in a world where that's the case.
Well, part of it is like I would say, the hermeneutics of suspicion. Everybody has a secret agenda. Mm-hmm. There's a hidden motive, blah, 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 blah. And so the capacity to find things beautiful and trustworthy is very, very, very wounded in us by all of this suspicion that we carry around. But the problem is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because we become isolated and suspicious, we become more prone to the manipulation and abuse of others. And then that justifies the suspicion, and then the whole thing starts to feed on itself in a very vicious fashion.
Yeah. And it's not completely unjustified. I mean, look at what's going on in the world around us. There's some things to be suspicious of.
Yes. The hermeneutics of suspicion isn't wrong in saying that there are times when appearances distort reality. It's wrong in saying that they always distort reality, because that argument can't be right. But so let's go back, and I think there's some really important stuff you said here about the practice of this. So kind of what an argument I've been making is that we have to go behind theory to theoria, and then the more original meaning is contemplation, contemplative practices. But the deeper meaning behind that, and Nightingale argued for this, and then Ward has developed it even more in her recent book, is pilgrimage. That's the original meaning of theoria. It's to travel, to behold something that that will transform you, and you have either a formal or a cultural responsibility to bring that back to where you left, and potentially tell others about it. And so this idea of pilgrimage is exactly what you said. To my mind, the point of pilgrimage is to challenge the autonomy of the self. Here I'm trying to build an argument that theoria, well, you're Eastern Orthodox. Theoria is bound to theosis, right?
Right.
Is bound to theosis, right? And to the degree to which you attempt to become God is the degree to which you are falling into hell. That's your example. So how does theosis occur? Is it mere passivity? No. The pilgrimage is supposed to represent the way in which theosis is realized. You do something, but its job is to break up how you are holding on to yourself and your world, so you can be held by something, you behold something, right, that challenges you and transforms you beyond what you could have calculated or predicted or eventuated. So it breaks up your autonomy. And so theosis, right, is a state, you find a golden mean between autonomy and sort of heteronomy. This is Tillich I'm doing here. You're theonomous, which is you're in this state where you're neither autonomous nor are you completely determined sort of demonically, like the guy falling into hell or the underground man, right? Instead, you come to a fullness of being precisely because, like the way you have a relationship with your wife, you're not autonomous from her, but she's not just merely a demonic imposition on you, right? There is this mutuality, this common unity, the community. And what I'm trying to get at is, like, we have to have these practices that are not merely contemplative is a good beginning. But when people hear that, they hear just mindfulness. And the problem is we've folded mindfulness practices back into
Right.
the autonomous self. And that's what I'm trying to get at, right? I'm trying to challenge. No, we need a sense of contemplation that is pilgrimage. That is pilgrimage. We need to do embodied practices. We need to do a lot of things in order. And I heard you saying that this is, these two things. This is liturgy and love. You talked about the sacraments,
Right.
right? In which we're not just contemplating, although there's a contemplative aspect. We're
Right.
doing something. I'm stretching the term a little bit, but we're doing something like pilgrimage. Where love is the painful recognition that something other than yourself is real, right? That's Murdoch, and liturgy is, well, I mean, the Christian church doesn't like it, but it's basically theurgia. One is trying to make oneself receptive to the action or presence of God in some
Yeah,
sense.
I think that's a fair. So I like the receptive
Yep.
terminology. No, it's not passive. We have to make ourselves suitable to receive
Yep.
what's coming. It's not that it's not given to us, but we're in a state where it kind of like bounces off, whatever metaphor you want to use. It's not something that we are. In the paper I wrote on Platonic virtue epistemology, I talked about the two virtues we need: humility, uh, willingness to recognize that we are ignorant. That's
Yep.
I get that out of several places in Socrates, Plato, and openness, and a willingness to receive. I think they go hand in hand. But the way I see this openness is kind of like a slotted cylinder or something, and the notch is turned away from the thing.
Right.
You have to
Right.
turn it in the right direction so the little ball can go down into the slot. And that may be a bad metaphor, but that's
No, I
kind
like it. I think it's a good metaphor.
that's kind of how I see it. And I like the transformative idea. I think that's very important for us Orthodox, and I think this is right. The transformation is into becoming human. The problem is that we aren't human now. We have to become human, and when we fulfill our ontological telos or goal, or become theosis, being human is being in the image of God or the likeness of God for us, then we are what we are supposed to be. And this is an argument I make in my ethics class. Ethics is not about being happy in the traditional sense, being happy in the Aristotelian or Platonic sense would be right, but not the way we understand it, not the mill sense, literal sense. But ethics is being about the right kind of being. When we are the right kind of being, when we are truly human, then we function the way a human being functions. And that's functioning as a good human being, like a good guitar player or somebody that plays the guitar well. It's the function doesn't determine what the thing is. What the thing is determines the function. Because I stab somebody with my pen doesn't make it a knife. The function of the pen is to write because it's a pen. It's not a pen because it writes. It writes because it's a pen. Ethically, when I become the human being I'm supposed to be, then I will function the way a human being is supposed to function, and then I'm an ethical person. Then I'm doing the things I'm supposed to be doing.
So let me make sure I'm understanding you. You're saying that basically what's happening in theoria into theosis, helped by some theurgia and some theophany, is that we are actually becoming human in some deep way, and this was often talked about I'll probably get this the wrong way around, so forgive me. You can correct me. But the Cappadocian Fathers make like a distinction between the image and the likeness of God.
Yeah.
Right. And that.
I get
And,
confused on that too. We've lost the likeness and kept the image, I think is the way
yeah,
it goes, and we're
that's
trying
my
to work our
understanding.
way into the likeness.
Yeah. Where I think what they're trying to get with likeness as opposed to image is something much less representational and more in an affinity, affinity, conformity,
Right.
a sense.
More ontological.
Right. Now, I think this is right, and I think it's powerful, and because I think the participatory knowing is also this deeper thing. I mean, Descartes always sneaks it in. I know that I'm a substance because I'm a substance. I know that I'm a mind because I'm a mind. It's like, yeah, that's right. That's participatory knowing. But like, why don't you allow that? But anyways, we'll put that aside. So Catherine Pickstock, in her After Writing, makes an argument that philosophy has to culminate in liturgy, because only in liturgy. I'm using my language, but only in liturgy do we get the perspectival and participatory transformation that gives us the at-oneing that will ultimately ground any kind of propositional argument we're trying to make. And I think you're making that argument too.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's in liturgy that we um, find this participatory
Yep.
relation with God and others. It's not just a one way. It's
Yep. The horizontal, vertical, like that. I like what you did. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I like that. That's exactly right. Yeah, I think that's so. This then is a very interesting point because you don't discuss this too much, although I think there's allusions to it. It sounds like another thing that comes out of substance ontology, given the other arguments we made and the argument we just made. And I'm not claiming it's the sole cause. There's all kinds of historical reasons.
right.
But part of the philosophical justification for secularism, it was actually a substance ontology because it drives us this way. It drives us this way. So, for example, I give up the idea of participatory perspectival knowing. I give up contact because relationality becomes very problematic. I get isolated. I become autonomous, and the solipsism, the skepticism, the nihilism are now looming. But it also means that I don't have to undergo transformation. What I have to rely on is something that is completely autonomous, which is something like what we get from Descartes, right? We get the completely internal computational system, or Leibniz and Newton, the universal mathematics, the universal calculus that will allow me to calculate all things. And that requires no contact with a transformative reality. It requires no theoria. It requires no theosis. It is ultimately a secularizing argument. I'm not claiming that Descartes is secular,
No.
but do you see what I'm saying? If substance ontology is entailing all these other things, now I know secularism arises for a lot of other reasons, like the religious wars of the 17th century,
Right.
16th and 17th century are the main cause politically. But it becomes conceivable for people because I think I'm trying to make an argument that secularism also seems to be entailed by a substance ontology in a very powerful way.
How are we? Let me get clear how we're understanding secularism. I haven't read Charles Taylor's. What is
Secular
it?
Age?
Yeah. What I understand about it is that it's a progressive disenchantment. We move further. If I understand it right, we're moving further and further away from this idea of the enchanted world.
Yes. So so let's do Taylor. I think Taylor's helpful, and then Desmond's a good add-on. The disenchantment is because of the buffered self. The self becomes self-enclosed, self-protecting, self-determining, autonomous. And my suggestion is that seems to be something entailed or at least justified by a substance ontology of the self in some deep way. If
Yeah.
you were an inherently, as Desmond would said, if you're an inherently porous entity, an inherently relational entity, right, then you're moving, like the buffered self, seems to arise, again, not solely, but at least partially because the relational self has become questionable and threatening to people in some profound way.
I wonder how threatening, other than this idea that I've been seeing, that, if I sacrifice myself, then I'm somehow being harmed. I'm wondering what.
Well, I have a suggestion we could explore.
Okay,
and I'm going
that'd be
to.
great.
And I was alluding to it earlier. We seem to have another dichotomy, which is I'm either completely determined by some foreign other, heteronymous, demonic possession kind of model.
Okay.
And that's why the demonic possession becomes such a huge issue as we're rolling into modernity, right?
Okay.
It's not a huge issue in the Middle Ages. It becomes really huge, right? And so the only defense against that is the buffered self, the autonomous, self-enclosed, completely self-legislating, self-determining. That's how I'm safe. I'm safe that way.
Yeah, I think, interestingly enough, that was back to Charles Williams and the Descent to Hell. That's the reason the guy started isolating anyway, because he was in love with this woman, got rejected by her, and she was hurt. So he created this golem kind of the woman that he had this relationship with, but it was a complete literal creation of his own mind that took on reality. But that just began his descent
into
away
hell
from everybody else, and became more and more isolated. And so what's the safeness, the safety?
The safety, the security, the right. So back, like I said, so Tillich is deeply influenced by Schelling, so this ultimately goes back to Schelling, but I'm relying on Tillich's notions here, right? So Tillich says, there between these is we're looking for theonomy, which is not theocracy, by the way. It is not theocracy. He makes that very repeatedly clear, okay? But theonomy is this, what we're talking about with theosis. Theonomy is you're not autonomous, and you're not just other determined, demonically, as he often puts. It is right. It is where the relationality is that with which you identify with. Now let me add one more bit to that. Right. So the idea is you need theonomy ultimately. There's a lot of argument in between, so I'm skipping some steps.
That's fine.
So, Galen Strawson has the paradox of self-transcendence. If I just extend myself like your man going to hell, there's no transcendence. If it's just something completely foreign to me, that's not self-transcendence. That's just demonic possession, right? And then he says, therefore, self-transcendence is impossible. Now, he's being Galen Strawson. He's being provocative. He's not saying he's absolutely refuted. But we seem to have clear instances of insight and intuition in the philosophical sense that seem to be something like we neither manufacture nor receive, but we participate in. These are the examples. See, that the only thing that actually grounds self-transcendence as a reality is a theonomy, as opposed to an autonomy or a heteronomy.
Okay.
Does that make sense as an argument?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it kind of goes back to we find ourselves by transcending ourselves.
Yes.
So, but it's not an abandoning of the self. It's the true self-fulfillment, but it's not this, this is what I like. I, as an individual, like this fulfills me, which I have a problem with the way we understand self-fulfillment.
Yes.
Currently in some of the philosophical literature. But it's the self-fulfillment through self-transcendence in this ultimate union that we have. with the world and with, vertically with God, the source, relationality itself. So
And that's why I was trying to tie theoria to theosis.
yeah,
Because theosis keeps the self-transcendence, which is also theophany, because it's not the self making the transcendence, it's
right,
self-transcendent, right? That's what keeps the theoria from just degenerating into McMindfulness that I pursue for my autonomous contentment with myself.
right, yeah. The church fathers, I think, the Orthodox church fathers make that point all the time. Theoria and theosis are not really distinguished that much.
No,
Theoria may be the way we attain theosis, but they're very closely interrelated.
I tend to think of theoria as the bottom up and theosis as the top down, right? And
Fair.
yeah. Um, so so there's this really vicious cycle here that as we move into substance ontology, self-transcendence becomes ontologically very problematic. How can like if it's independent and completely self-subsistent, like self-transcendence, and that means, and as you rightly argue, we always think of self-transcendence just as sort of a but right, but self-transcendent means God can't come into relationship to the world because he's completely self-enclosed. He's completely substantial. And then one of the things I saw you providing very powerful argument for is why God progressively becomes absurd, because God becomes more and more something that we cannot have any real relationship.
Yes, it's not just that you can't know God in a discursive sense. You can't have any relationship with him at all.
At all.
Yeah.
At all.
And
yeah.
Nietzsche makes that very point, in his critique of Kant. Kant relies on the noumena. He's like kind of trying to cling that last exteriority thing. Yeah, I have to assume it's there. It's the condition for the possibility of my phenomena. But ultimately, I can't know anything about it. I can't talk about it. And Nietzsche just says, well, why do you even have it?
Yeah.
What purpose does it serve? Just get rid of it.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think he's right. I think Nietzsche was right. If that's what you've got, then you don't have anything.
That's right. I agree. I think if we can't relate, I've coined a term transformity, which means sort of transforming conformity. If we can't enter into transformity with God, then God becomes absurd very, very quickly. I noticed another theme that was coming through, that as substance ontology takes more and more root, the will becomes more and more pronounced as the faculty, both within human beings and within God. That was showing up in a lot. Like I saw precursors. Even Aquinas says something like everything is trying its best to maintain its existence, and I'm saying that sounds like Spinoza's Conatus, all the way back in Aquinas. And then of course Occam is emphasizing God's will tremendously. Descartes goes crazy about the will, like he does. You cite it. He argues that our will is what makes us the image of God. Wow, that's like that's already like this far away from Nietzsche, right? The will to power. It is, right?
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche is like, what makes us, divine is our will, that how we best participate in the will to power, which is ultimate reality.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I hadn't thought of that consciously, but yeah.
So James, this could come off the wrong way, and I have tremendous respect for your work and affection for you. So make sure that we make sure it lands well. It seems sort of really apparent that substance ontology is kind of a disaster. And our science has, Whitehead made this point a long time ago. Our science has basically abandoned substance as its ontological categories. We're into relational entities all the way through: relativity, fields, right, entanglement, right. Pass has written a book called The One, in which he explicitly evokes a Neoplatonic framework for saying this is how we have to try and understand how we can put together relativity and quantum. There's lots of that happening. Why is this not getting out? Like, if both are like really good philosophy, so let's do all three: really good philosophy, really good genealogy, and really good philosophy of science and history of science are just undermining this. Why is this still so pervasive? I would put it to you that the ontotheological critique of Heidegger, and I think you agree with this, is basically the critique of God as a substance.
Absolutely. What I think of when you say, why isn't this taking hold? Well, first, I think we're just now starting to get back to this. And I'm reminded of Nietzsche's comment in The Madman. When the madman's in the middle and he looks around at everybody after he said all this, throws down his lamp, he says, I've come too early. Lightning, thunder still require time before their effects are felt. We've already killed God, but the effects haven't been felt yet. I would argue that, oh, sorry, I had a cat and she just left.
Okay.
And I would argue that if that's why it hasn't taken hold yet. We're not ready for it yet.
So why? I agree with you. I think that Nietzschean pronouncement of the madman is right. We're not ready for it. There must be, like, when I look for the persistence of things, I look for them being parasitic on something that we value, we want to hold on to, that has some function for us. What is the substance ontology plugging into in order to keep it alive?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. What I want to say is the thing that drives me crazy when I hear people talk about it, especially in critiques of faith and things like that. Oh, it's reason. I rely on reason. Well, when you say you rely on reason, what you're talking about is discursive reasoning.
Yes.
But if you grow up in a society where that's what reason is, and the alternative is kind of this superstition, the alternative to discursive reasoning is superstition, and you don't have any other alternative, then you become really attached to this particular rational approach, not a true rational approach, I would argue, but it's kind of bastardized rationality. So I think that's one aspect of what we're so attracted to. We are rational beings. That is
I agree.
That is what, according to the ancients, that's what distinguishes us from the rest of the created order is our rationality. So people don't want to lose that. Now, we've lost the important part of that, but we still want to cling to what rationality is left. So I think that's part of the problem. We can't, and I think I see this, people can't understand what a non-discursive form of rationality would be.
Yeah, I agree.
Or you say it and they don't. Okay, discursive is kind of an obscure word. I understand that, but and I try to explain it to my students when I teach it. It's not a feeling. It's not a gut feeling. It's a seeing. That's what the word intuition means. It comes from the word to see. Plato talks about it in the Republic when he's talking about the good. It's seeing on the good. He uses this seeing language. But that just...
Well, isn't that therefore? I mean, there's a bit of critique then of the existing religious institutions, because if they're places where liturgy is supposed to teach us and give us a taste, which is, who was I reading the other day who keeps using this? Oh, Ibn Arabi, taste. Okay. Gives us the taste such that we could love, right? And those are all bound up together, right? This part is taste is even more intimate than seeing. It's like to actually be merged with something.
What is it the psalm says? Taste and see that the Lord is good.
Is good, right? Taste and see, which is this wonderful. That is those two paired together. That's a gem of a verse, by the way. Taste and see. So, given that the job of religion is to proclaim that, such that people take it seriously, the fact that it is so not taken seriously, isn't there some criticism to the existing institutions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, I think. Liturgy, the fullness of liturgy is being lost in our churches. And I think it's even being lost in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I can't speak authoritatively on that, but from what I see, maybe
Sebastian Morello has been arguing that. I just did a couple of discussions with him that the Catholic Church is losing its liturgical authority.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was in Europe, I would go. I was still Protestant at the time, Germany particularly, and Belgium when I was in school there. I'd go to a Catholic church, and I'd go to an evangelical church, the Lutheran church.
Yeah.
Exact same form. They both did the exact same things.
Yeah, I know. I've done that too.
But it was empty in the evangelical church, and there was still something real happening in the Catholic liturgy. And I found that really interesting, that the exact same forms, completely different spiritual realities. And I can't explain it. It's just something I recognized. My wife gets mad when I say that because she came from Lutheran.
Yeah, I belonged to a Lutheran church for a while too. I left fundamentalist Christianity, then I tried the Lutheran church. It still ultimately didn't work for me. But I totally understand what you're saying. It's interesting, like what has. I mean, first of all, I want to acknowledge, the churches, both Eastern, all of them, Protestant, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, have been guilty of some pretty horrible political and moral sins, political and moral, like things that are unjust and horrible.
Certainly.
And I think that's that's part, and they have justly lost trust because of that. They abused trust, they betrayed trust, and there's the consequence of the loss of trust. I get that. So I want to acknowledge that I think that's an important thing. I think the other thing is that there has been the idea that we will get people into the churches to the degree to we make church very accessible and comfortable for people, a kind of capitalist marketing approach. And the problem with that, the problem with that is it doesn't put people in the zone of proximal development. It doesn't require transformation in order for truth to be disclosed. And that goes against everything we've actually been arguing here in a fundamental way.
Yes, I agree.
Because right now what you're actually seeing, I think, as a response to some of what we've been talking about here, part of what I call the advent of the sacred, is that the decline of religion in America has fairly recently plateaued. And it's the liturgical churches are the ones that are now benefiting from the return to church, not the sort of more doctrinal evangelical sort of mega churches. They're actually falling on pretty hard times.
Yeah,
and I think it's because there is an often implicit understanding of the role of the symbolic, the ritual, the liturgical as crucially missing from a lot of the legacy churches.
Yeah, and I think it's, and I don't want to get into ideological criticisms here. I'm not trying to criticize any particular brand that
Yeah, I'm being probably harsher than you want to be. I'm trying to
no,
get
no, no,
at.
no.
I'm trying to get at a problem. I'm trying to get
I'm
at.
I'm I'm trying to avoid stepping on anybody's toes with my very harsh, what can be very harsh opinions. So I'm trying to be discreet or circumspect. Um, I think a big part of the problem, and I think you're alluding to this, is that churches, instead of trying to offer an alternative to the culture that we live in, are trying to conform to the
Right.
culture. And yeah, I'm not wanting to, that's what I was trying not to do, is criticize the culture. But people are looking for something beyond what they get.
Well, the culture is in a crisis. The culture is in the meaning crisis. It's in the trust apocalypse. It's in, like
Yeah.
blah 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 blah. So yes, of course.
And when the church is just trying to, come, we're just like, it's like going to a sports event or like this. Why would you go to that?
Yeah.
Why would you go to that? It's kind of doing the same thing we were criticizing earlier. It's feeding myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Orthodoxy, we call it the passions. It's feeding my own individual passions.
Maximus. Yeah.
That's
Yeah. It's not calling people to self-transcendence in the way we've talked about it. It's just informing their. It's feeding. I like that metaphor better that you used. It's feeding their sense of autonomy. That's
making them
very.
feel good.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a gravimetric problem for humanity. I mean, this is Plato's point. We will drift away. We will fall from being good into being satisfied with feeling good.
Right.
And then the problem with that is feeling good becomes problematic when there isn't anything that is good, and it just becomes empty. And and
yeah,
that's another Platonic argument.
it's another thing that I think we've lost. The idea that, Aristotle talks about it. I think Plato talks about it. There are pleasures that just aren't by nature pleasant. They shouldn't be pleasant. The fact that we find them pleasant says there's something wrong with us for finding them pleasant.
Yeah.
We don't make that distinction. Pleasant is good, unpleasant is bad. And well, if that's what you find pleasant, well, that's good for you. No, it's not. It's just not.
Yeah, I've gotten into the conversation around this. So somebody will say, "Oh, you should watch it. It's really dark," and I would say, "Okay, but why? Like, what's the dark for?" No, but it's dark. It's like, yeah, you just want to reinforce something. You like it being like you're finding things dark, and that should be causing you distress. But you want to alleviate the distress by trying to normalize the
Right.
dark, right? Rather than address the problem. I think there is an important role for people confronting darkness in great literature, like Moby Dick. There's the confrontation with darkness, but there's a point to that confrontation, right? It's not just to normalize it or think of the Heart of Darkness, right? That's one of the darkest thing you could possibly read. But the point is to be Marlowe and not to become Kurtz, right? Right. So yeah, I think that's right. I think we've satisfied with normalizing our things, the things that should be causing us distress, rather than addressing them, which I think is a very bad strategy overall. And I think social media and AI, especially if we get AGI, are just going to exacerbate that. In just titanic ways.
What's AGI?
Artificial general intelligence.
Oh, okay.
So until very recently, AI suffered from what's called the silo problem. So you could get an AI that could beat human beings and perhaps, go and chess, a few things, but it couldn't talk to you about Napoleonic history, or like, it was very siloed. And there were some good reasons for that. And then what the LLMs did, the large language models like ChatGPT, is they seem to be able to be highly proficient in multiple domains,
Right.
which is what we have. We have general intelligence, where we don't have just domain-specific intelligence. Of course, we have domain-specific intelligence. People have talents. They develop expertise around those talents. but everybody also has tremendous general intelligence. In fact, that seems to be one of our defining differences. I agree with you, though. I think that thinking that our difference from the other creatures is just about our intelligence is a mistake. I don't think that. I think all of the research by Stanovich and others, a lot of it, some of the best, most well replicated experimental work we have in psychology, is that intelligence is necessary but far from sufficient for rationality. Because rationality is not about logical manipulation of information, it is about the systematic and systemic overcoming of self deception, which is, of course, as you can hear, I'm not offering a Cartesian notion of rationality, I'm offering a Socratic notion
Right.
of rationality. But that's to answer your question.
Okay. Thanks.
So I'm going to, first of all, hold up the two books again and really make everybody feel bad if they aren't reading the books. These are great books. And I mean, come on, you see James on the screen. Like, this guy is coming to you. Sorry, James, I don't mean to talk to you in third person.
That's
But,
okay.
the humility, the honesty, the integrity is apparent. And it's also apparent in his work. And the clarity and the rigor of the arguments. This book, which I've recommended, and now we've been talking about, and you've heard some of the powerful and arguments made in Substance, Ontology, and the Crisis of Reason, the follow-up book, which I also give my strongest recommendation to. So these two books.
If it's too expensive for anybody, they can contact me on my academia.edu website, and I can make sure they get a copy.
There you go. Now you have no excuse.
Yeah, you don't have to pay $129 for it, or whatever it is.
No, you don't. And so for those of you who are impoverished students or whatnot, and I've been that way for a long time, but it is a really nice book, though. So James, I always, as you know, I'd like to give my interlocutor the last word. Let me first thank you. This has been wonderful. We've made a lot of interesting connections. I continue to be impressed, even surprised, although I shouldn't be, about the deep convergence between your work and mine, and the deep way in which you're informing and transforming my thinking, and I appreciate that.
I appreciate that very much. It means a lot.
Are there any final words you would like to leave with our viewers?
No, I think that's sufficient. We've talked about a lot.
Yeah, we did a lot. Thank you, my friend. We'll be talking again.